Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 9 from the 2023 World Chess Championship match. Ian Nepomniachtchi has the white pieces in this one and is leading 4.5, 3.5. Let's have a look. Another e4 game, Ruy Lopez, and for the first time in the match we're seeing the Berlin defense. However, we don't go into the familiar Berlin endgame with the queen exchange, queenless middle game, but instead d3, watching over e4, bishop c5, c3, cuts out any knight jump to d4, and a handful of moves from now this knight will look to reposition. As it is right now, the c-pawn does a good job of controlling this piece. Okay, from here castles both sides, d5, knight d2, tension is immediately released. a5, a4, queen e7, queen c2, and just a handful of moves. We're going to note that the majority of the pieces are opposite one another. It's a very symmetrical position, and I'll just be making some notes of the differences. Very few differences will soon be present in this game. Now, from here, Black looks to work with this knight. It's a developed piece, but it's an out-of-play piece. It's off the back rank, but out of play. So it goes back home. Black gets to an open file. There's no concern in this position if the knight goes to g4. We have a convenient defense against f2. So that's no bother. Black gets on the open file. h3, h6, each side has their flight square in. Repositioning to g3, and now we have c6, bishop c4, knight a6, knight g3, queen c7. So this is the point I want to pause at. What's the same? What's different about this position? These are the only differences in the position. We have a full c-file, everything the same there, everything the same except for what the pieces I have highlighted right here. So how is this maybe helpful? One of the things I look to is, well, what could this knight be doing? You know, if I'm playing as white, I'd be looking at what this guy could do. How am I going to maybe tame this piece if it one day gets to, let's say, c5? Am I going to be able to watch over the squares it's controlling once it's on c5? What about this guy? What am I doing as Black? If this guy gets here, am I going to capture the knight? Am I going to tolerate it on f5? These are some of the questions I'd be asking myself once I identify these differences in the position. All right. From here, bishop to a2, b5. Now, ideally, what Black would like to have happen here, well, I should mention that this was a move that Nepomniachtchi was questioned about in the press conference. He was asked about bishop a2. What was your thinking behind that? And he said something like, I have no idea. So I'm not sure what point to make with bishop to a2 myself. I don't know. Is he kind of waiting for what Black is going to come up with next? He doesn't want to declare his intentions just yet. I'm not quite sure myself what that's about. One thing we can note about that last move is a square that it gives up. It's no longer pointing in these two directions. It's all in on basically just this one right here. It's no longer controlling b5. So b5 is now available and hits. Now, in an ideal world, given several moves in a row, Black would like to get this guy out of the way, play knight c5, and increase the pressure on a4, so much so that white feels compelled to capture on b5. Then Black recaptures, maintains a strong duo, the queen is helped, there could be a pin then on the c-pawn, and Black can look forward to establishing a pawn in white's camp with a4. It's very messy, all these lines I've drawn, but the idea in short is to get this guy to c5 and put pressure on a4 from here. Okay. White puts pressure on b5 first, though. It doesn't give time to black to, let's say, play bishop f8, knight c5. However, black could play this in a gambit style. The reply in this position is rook b8, defending b5 directly. But there's a very nice pawn sacrifice available for black. This is considered the best move right here, bishop f8 instead of rook b8. What's the idea? Well, let's have a look. A takes b, c takes b, queen takes b, knight c5. What's happening here? Well, the knight, one of the only differences in the position that I noted earlier, the knight on a6, knight on g3, this guy is soon to be an absolute animal on d3. What is it not hitting? Additionally, bishop a6 is right around the corner and the queen would be trapped. In short, this is where the compensation lies with this pawn sacrifice. A 6th ranked knight is now in white's house. A black knight on d3. Follow-up moves bishop a6. Carried out 2 more moves. It's suggesting in this position the best move for white is to play c4. That is very, very ugly. Apparently trying to tame the bishop along this diagonal, but you are weakening these squares. This guy is a clown on a2. Okay. There is a gambit at this point available to black. Go back, give up a b-pawn, look to get this knight to d3. In this game, rook b8, knight h4. So this queen move was not actually just about putting pressure here. She is now only a step away from being irritating on the king side. Play follows with bishop to f8. Now, moments ago, both bishops were right here. If this guy tries to take a similar approach as this guy, which is to say back up to a7 and stay opposite the king, well, the dark squares are now that much more vulnerable on the king side. Black needs to address this. A knight on f5, you're really starting to ask, as black, you're starting to ask for sacrifices on h6 or g7. Okay. He needs to take he needs to take up a defensive posture. Goes to f8. Watches over g7 and h6. From here, queen f3. This pawn is now overloaded. Has to watch over h6 and f6. Black allows that capture. He continues in the best way in the computer's eyes, which is to capture on a4. Now, this looks very ugly to do this with the structure, but the mentality here, I believe, needs to change. And what I mean by that is, don't care as much about structure in this position, but maybe put more of an emphasis. Maybe what is required in this position is to have a more of an emphasis on piece play. So also with rook b8 played just moves ago, we are kind of justifying that move. We are opening up the b file for it and reminding white that should you develop the bishop, we may capture on b2 one day. So the pawns are split. Black is up a pawn, but it's not really felt as if he's really up a pawn. White is able to now recapture. In a way, he gets the pawn back, capturing on h6. And from here, we have knight c5. So at this point right here, move 20, it may be tempting to grab on b2. That would not be a good move. That would be a losing move, in fact. The move played here is knight c5. What's the issue with rook takes b2? It's bishop to g5, and this is really irritating pin. How do you deal with it? Rook d6 could be met with knight to f5. That's going to be a problem for black. If you think you could break the pin with bishop to e7, well, actually, this knight is still pinned if you play bishop to e7. You're not pinned in this direction, but with the bishop on e7, you'd be blocking the queen from defending f7, and so the knight is now pinned along a file. in this case, and white would be able to continue with the move like knight h5, piling up further on the knight that is still pinned. Okay. How is knight c5 different than rook to b2? Well, if white now plays bishop to g5, in the game knight g6 is played. If bishop g5 is played in this case, black has an only move, and it ties in with this knight on c5. Black would be able to play rook d3, and this distracts the queen from observing the f6 knight, and also gets out of the pin, so the knight is free to move. Okay, no bishop g5, knight g6, taking advantage of the pinned pawn. From here, rook takes b2, only now. Knight takes bishop. Black recaptures with the rook. Taking with the king goes into a pin. White would be winning after queen takes knight. Rook takes knight. Bishop g5. This is the first moment. Okay, we just had the capture of the dark square bishop. Imbalance on board. Unopposed dark square bishop. And there are a lot of black pieces that are on dark squares. So just highlighting all of these. Are any of them on the same diagonal for this guy to bother them? Yes, these two right here. How could we maybe get on that diagonal? Well, first things first, watch how this guy tries to be a bug. First, he goes to g5 and says, go to some other square. You're too good here. Counterattack. Only after the knight has been demoted does the bishop go elsewhere. He now hits this guy, says, get out of my house. The rook does, falls back, anticipating bishop a3. That's the move that follows. An interesting moment is this position right here, actually. This is not considered best. This is, in the computer's eyes, best, rook c2. And if white is to react to rook c2 the same way he ended up reacting to rook b5, or in other words, if you meet rook c2 with bishop a3 in this position, this would not be good for white, because the knight could actually go here and you could give up the exchange. How is this looking in the end? Bishop takes rook. Knight gets back in the ball game. There's a problem here and here. You move the rook, you're going to drop the bishop. And if you take the knight, you have straightened out the pawns, and these guys are really dangerous. So, in the game, we have rook b5, no rook c2. Also, another interesting variation that comes from rook c2 is this one here with queen d1. You could actually take this bishop on c1. This is kind of cute. Rook takes c1. If you're taking with the queen, you get the material back with knight d3. And if you take with the rook, well, it's just going to take a little longer, but eventually this knight, we're seeing another variation where it gets to drop into d3. After first rook d8, hitting the queen moves, and there you go. The knight arrives on d3, and you're going to be getting the material back. Okay, in this game, the rook goes to b5, bishop a3. Black gets out of the pin and also supports bishop to e6. So it may seem like, let's get out of the pin, let's go to an open file, but he's thinking more about this guy right here. It's a very strong piece. He has an idea to offset it. From here, it's bishop c4. You can't move the rook. You're going to drop the knight if you do. So black is now prepared to play down the exchange. From here, bishop to e6. And as Ding Liren pointed out in the press conference, Nepomniachtchi's reply on this move 27 came as a shock to him. The move played is bishop takes bishop. So how much time was spent at this moment here? He has 46 minutes. Spent about 15 minutes on bishop c4. Bishop e6, he spends another 3 and changes his mind in the end. He doesn't go for bishop takes rook. So why didn't he maybe go for this? Let's have a look at this imbalance, this material imbalance. If bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop, here's some continuation, queen e3, pressure on the knight. Knight b3 isn't considered great because after rook a to d1, the knight really doesn't have a great jump from there. It's saying best for black is to look at b6 or mainly look to get to c4. This is the dream outpost for the knight within this structure. Why? Well, it puts pressure on a blockader. These guys are passed, so a little pressure here, get going with a3. This is basically what black is looking to do in this position, looking to get a knight into c4. White can be disruptive in a couple of ways, putting pressure on the b pawn, maybe trying to get here. It's considered around a half pawn advantage for white. Okay. Not a direction he goes. He doesn't play with this material imbalance. Instead, it's a light square bishop exchange. Knight recaptures. Knight f5, looking at this square right here, ready to land a fork. c5 cuts off the bishop from that intersection square. Queen e2, queen c4. Very strong post for the queen. She did have pressure on a4. Can't really defend a4. Bishop c1. This bishop's getting a workout. Going back home again. And now this is hit twice. Cannot be defended. So black improves a piece in the meantime. Queen takes a. We're going to get a series of exchanges now from move 32 through, well, for the next several moves. You could capture in a different way on a4. If you capture with the rook, we could have another interesting position come about after rook takes c3, deflecting the queen. Queen takes rook, queen takes pawn. Kind of tricky to evaluate this position. It's considered roughly equal. A bit concerning here, as I'd be a bit concerned as black, actually. If you get this rook to g3, right around the corner, a third piece is going to be in the mix. Could be a problem there for the king. Two passers, tough one to assess, really. Okay, not a direction we go. Instead, queen takes a. Queens are off. C pawn is gone. E pawn is gone. A pawn is gone. Another pawn is gone. Rooks are off. Rook a4. And now, very interesting decision here by Ding Liren. During the live stream, I was thinking to myself, if he played knight d2 in this position and offered a draw, I was wondering, would Nepomniachtchi have agreed to it? This was about 3.5 hours into the game at this stage. He didn't play knight to d2, but instead went for a line where he gives up a pawn. Knight d4, takes, and we enter this position where it's pawns on the same side, king side, 2 versus 3. But it turns out to be a bit tricky to hold. There are some problems that white poses to black. You have to be careful in some lines. And this game goes on for many more moves and a good two more hours. So, how does it develop? First gives the knight a kick. Knight g3, a little fancy move. Take the knight. A knight exchange at this point with the rooks on should be easy enough to hold. You just don't exchange rooks. And also this one right here, another offer of a knight exchange. So it may be tempting to go for this as white, exchange knights, but there really isn't great progress to make. As black, you could basically see this position right here and say, how are you making progress? This is a nice shelter for the king. The rook could look to stay on the 8th rank, or if white starts to hint at maybe getting a pawn duo created on g4 and h4, you could start to be irritating to the white king on the 2nd or 3rd ranks. pressure on the pawns and the king, or maybe both, pinning a pawn. So, does not go for the knight exchange, even though there'd be double isolated pawns. Instead, knight g4. Offer rook exchange. It's declined for now, but eventually we'll see that it is accepted. After f5, rook e7. White says, if I'm going to exchange rooks, let's do it on the 8th rank. And we have that. King takes. Only one move now for black. You have to push the pawn. Okay. Easy enough to see that. Save the pawn. Now h4. Carving out a square on f4 for the king. G takes h. King f4. And now a bizarre looking move. h3. It's not the only move. You could improve the king to e7, but he goes with h3 in this position. He was thinking, as he shared in the press conference, that this was the only way to draw the position, to split up these pawns. But you could go with king to e7 here. I'd like to play out a couple moves, several moves. King e7, you could have this check. Could win the pawn like this, but black is still okay. We could get to a position like this where there's, let me put this one on actually. We could get to a position like this where the king is on g5, but black would have checks. Knight f7 is one way to continue here. Continuation like knight f7, knight e5, something like this is a way. So I know in a position like this, black is kind of tied up. Pressure on f5, but we have these checks available in this position, knight f7, knight e5. Okay, he went with h3. Proceed with caution, going with an idea like this, because a passed rook pawn is a nightmare for a knight. Has to work extra hard in order to track it down. Okay, now the king improves, king e7. You have a check. Knight's going on the offensive. And saying, if you take here, I take here. This is what black wants at this point. Trade a pair of pawns and then sacrifice the knight for the remaining pawn, and it'll be a draw. So, not so fast. The h-pawn moves. Check. King g6. We have an attempt here to exchange knights. That will bring us to a 1 king and pawn ending for white. That's avoided. Stay on opposite colors. You're not going to get forked by a knight. King f4, no thank you. King f2, where is he going exactly? Check here. Could we exchange knights now? Actually, we can, surprisingly enough. And this is an instructive ending right here. He didn't give any thought to this one, really. He spent about 30 seconds, black did, and he played knight to d4. But you could actually take on f4 and it will be a draw. So I like to carry this out and show you how this plays out. King takes knight, king takes knight, king takes pawn, and we run. The passers go. There's one only move here for black. Not the most difficult one to spot. I must admit, during the live stream, I quickly made a king move and it was the wrong move. I figured let's go here and kind of shoulder off the king, but the main idea is to go in the other direction where you're not only supporting the pawn once it's looking to promote on f1, but you have in mind the corner square. And these endings where the stronger side has the queen, but you have either a bishop pawn or a rook pawn one step away from queening, and your king is close by assisting its advance, and the stronger side's king is out of play. I know that was a mouthful, but in these scenarios, this will be a draw. How so? If you're unfamiliar with this, let me just play it out a little bit more. I do have a video on this in the Beginner to Chess Master playlist. This is the drawing resource. We don't have to go in front of the pawn. We could give him up because this would be stalemate. Okay, that's several moves down the line, but these guys could definitely have Ding Liren could have definitely calculated this, but I think he just was in, he figured it's maybe just going to be a loss. So he didn't do any calculation on that one. He played knight to d4. This doesn't carry out for much longer, actually. Not too much more effort is required in this ending. There's a way that you could still go wrong. Definitely have to avoid the knight exchange still. Finally, we do have a pawn move, f4. Here's one way you could go wrong as black. If you play king h5, you'd be losing. King h5 instead of the move played in the game, king h6. King h5 would be able to be met with king h3. If you move the knight, you lose the pawn. And if you move the king, you give up the g5 square, and you will soon enough be losing the f-pawn. White would be winning if the king goes here. So, stay off of this square. Only go here if king h3 is played first. King h5, knight c1. Now there isn't pressure on f4, so now this king could go here because this guy is ready to go on the offensive. King h5, king h3 in the game. Now black goes hunting for the f-pawn. The knight cannot move and defend this point. And if the king moves to defend, that gives up h4. So in the end, we end up having these guys exchanged, and this one goes no further. Players agree to a draw in this position. All black has to do is eventually sacrifice the knight for the pawn. There's no winning chances at this stage. So we end up getting to move 82 instead of maybe a possible draw offer on move 38 if knight d2 was played. I think it may have been accepted, and we could have had this game finish maybe 2.5 hours sooner, but this one was the longest one so far in the match, just shy of a 6-hour game, number 9. So what does that bring us to? 5-4. Nepomniachtchi still leads by a point going into a rest day. Okay, let's have a look at the tail to tape. Here we are. And yeah, very high accuracy. I think a lot of it has to do with how many moves were played in this one. 96% accuracy to 97. If it was cut off at maybe this point right here, we might see the accuracy go down a little bit more. But a lot of the moves in the ending were, you had plenty of top moves to be picking from, so it helped out with the accuracy, but still a very high-level game at the end of the day. Anyhow, feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.